just said, we're happy to have Kyle Gorman back with us. He's talked to us a couple of other times, I believe, and we thought it was time for a little update. And just some information about Kyle. He is a rare individual. He's the 5th generation Oregonian, born in Salem. He graduated from Central High in Independence and attended Western Oregon University, and then moved to Eugene, where he received a BS in geology from the aforementioned university. His first job was in Elko, Nevada. When you're a geologist, you get out in the boonies. In 1990, he moved to Bend to take a job with the Oregon Water Resources Department, where he has worked ever since. He has held the position of Watermaster Technician, Hydrogeologist, Watermaster, and currently Regional Manager of the South Central region, which includes the Deschutes, Klamath, and Lake Basins. He's also a board member of the Deschutes River Conservancy since 2001, and was a founding member of the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council, but resigned from the board after only 18 years. He has 2 sons, 23 and 17, and he likes many of the outdoor activities that a lot of Central Oregonians enjoy. And he mentioned he's trying to dip his toe in the water, so to speak, with whitewater rafting. And I would have thought, being a water master, he would have been an expert at that. But anyway, Kyle?
Can I make one more little announcement real quick?
You may.
Just for the people on Zoom, I know a lot of you are Ollie members. We're using a little bit different format. Usually we have the Zoom meeting where you raise your hand. Today, as Liz put in the chat, please submit questions to chat. So it's a little different than some of you are used to. And then for the people in the room, other important info, bathroom is right back there to the right, so you don't have to go too far. Okay, Kyle, thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, Russ, and thanks everybody for coming for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here, but I want to let you know that I picked up a cold from my son. Started feeling bad on Tuesday. Took a little bit of time off, rested, did all the things you're supposed to do to gear up for this talk on Friday morning. So I'm a little bit under the weather. I've got medicine in me, so it kind of dries up my mouth, and hopefully I can still do this and keep the energy up to get through this. So if I seem a little lower energy, that's why, is I'm fighting off a cold. And I tested myself for COVID last night. It was negative, and I don't have a fever, so it's just a cold. So we don't have to worry about it. Also, for the talk, what would be I think best for us is that if I'm talking about a subject and maybe something isn't clear, you have a question related to what I'm talking about, that's great. At the end, if you have questions that are unrelated to what I'm talking about, go ahead and save those for the end, and I'll be happy to try to answer all your questions at the end. If you have just something that you heard or something in the news that didn't sound right, or you had questions about, save those for the end. But I will entertain questions while I'm talking on the subject matter that I'm talking about, just for clarification. If that makes sense for everybody. All right. So show of hands for folks who've been in the basin for 1 year or less, lived here 1 year or less. Okay. How about 5 years or less? Okay. How about 10 years or less? And then 20 years or less. Okay. All right. So we have a little bit of mixture. I always like to get a feel for the audience about how long they've lived here, what they've seen, because the weather in Central Oregon can vary. It can be really cold. It can be really dry, hot. We do get a few, rainstorms, snowstorms, and unusual events. But really what I'm going to focus on is give an overview of the Oregon Water Resources Department, talk about the hydrology of the basin, this Deschutes Basin, touch a little bit on Klamath and Lake County, part of my region, the mitigation program that we have, and then take a pretty deep dive into where we are at with the water conditions for the basin. So I've got a lot of slides. I was also mentioning that I have one of my staff members is actually a PhD in geology, and he went to Oregon State. He was a professor at University of Alaska. He puts the slides together for me, And so they're pretty fancy, and he's got a lot of stuff in there that, so I'm kind of, he does the slideshow and then I give the talk. So it's kind of it's a great way to do it, because he can do a much better job than I can putting this together. So, and a little bit of short-term forecasting and maybe some long-term, look at, what is in store for us from a, Pacific Northwest perspective. And that picture there it's a gauging station, on Snow Creek, and it's the highest gauge in the state of Oregon. So it's up in the Three Sisters, right next on the border of the Three Sisters Wilderness area. But anyway, more on that. Let's see. So the cursor doesn't work with but my mouse does. Is that showing up? Okay. So a little bit of orientation of where I have been working. So we see Bend right here. These numbers are the Watermaster districts. And then this blue outline is the region. So the Oregon Water Resources Department breaks up the state into 5 regions. I happen to be the manager of the South Central region, which is in this, for some reason, the map. Oh, there we go. So the Klamath Basin here, Lake County, and then the Deschutes Watermaster District, and then a new Watermaster District. The district number 24 is the Crooked River Basin. And so that was divvied up from the District 11 office a couple years ago. And the reason why was the workload was so tremendous, and there's some new things going on in the Crooked River Basin that requires additional staff and additional work. I can talk a little bit about that. So, and then the smallest Watermaster district also is another new one. It's the Walla Walla up here, district number 23. So we have Northwest region over here out of Salem, Southwest, North Central up here, and then the Eastern region, which happens to be about 35% of the entire state. So that region is a huge region. What does Watermaster do? Well, we measure river flows, reservoirs. We monitor groundwater levels. Our department issues water rights, although issuing water rights is quite a bit different now and today in 2023 than it was 100 years ago when the department started issuing water rights. There's a lot more to it, a lot more evaluation. Enforce water law. Some folks maybe have a pretty good understanding of water law. Maybe they've heard about it. Doesn't make any sense to them. But the Watermaster's primary job is to regulate water among water right holders, their relative rights on a stream system. And so the priority date in Oregon, as all Western states west of the Mississippi, are what are called prior appropriation states. So the oldest water right gets water the longest in times of shortages. So priority date is really key. And a Watermaster's primary job is to regulate water use among those water right holders. We also have our mission in there, is that not only do the department regulate water use, but we also have an eye towards how can we enhance or improve stream flow in locations. And the Deschutes Basin is one of the key or premier basins where stream restoration has occurred. Being part of the Deschutes River Conservancy, the amount of water that has been restored to stream flow is far greater than any other basin in the West. And that is remarkable. I'll talk a little bit more about how that's done, but just know that in the Deschutes Basin, we're renowned for stream restoration and work for stream flow improvement. And in my career here in almost 33 years, I've worked in Bend. I've seen incredible changes with the streams, water management, and how the system is managed due to voluntary measures and as well as compulsory measures through Endangered Species Act. We also, the department, my perspective, I work with the Field Services Division. So that's basically the regulatory enforcement arm of our agency. But our agency also has a whole variety of things that we deal with. And over the past 5 years, our department has grown. Believe it or not, we have hired 100 staff in our agency. So a few years ago, our staff was about 160 full-time equivalent folks. Now we're well over 230. So the department and the state of Oregon has recognized that, hey, water in the 21st century is important, and we need to hire staff to manage that water. So we also have a division of the agency that grants funds for projects within the state of Oregon. So if somebody wants to do a water, well, storage comes to mind first off, but there's many other things other than that. Storage project, a conservation project. Our department actually has been given funds from the state legislature to grant money to do those sort of projects. And that hasn't always been the case. That's a relatively new thing for our agency. So our horizons and our scope of the duties that we do have been expanding tremendously over the past decade. It's quite remarkable, and it's unprecedented for the number of staff that we've hired. Up until this recent time, it was pretty stagnant. We weren't adding a lot of staff, so it is amazing. But water's becoming more important. Seems like there's less of it around, so we've got to make it go farther than we ever have in the past, as well as population growth in Oregon is increasing too. A little bit about the Deschutes and something that near and dear to my heart. I've worked in the Deschutes Basin more than half my life, which is pretty remarkable. Normally, a state employee typically will move around the state, take different positions and promotions. I was lucky enough to be promoted within the region in the basin. And my former boss, Bob Main, I don't know if anybody that name rings a bell, but he was brilliant and he loved the Deschutes just as much as I did. And he got a lot of the work, a lot of the ideas, a lot of things that we see today that we're benefiting from were ideas from Bob Main. And so working with him was very informative for me. It developed my passion for the basin, for what I do and work, and then always striving for where can we improve the streams? What can we do to do things better than we have in the past? So that was a great time to work for him. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2013, much too soon. If anybody goes down to the Old Mill District, there's a little platform by the where they bicycle rentals. And if you walk out on that platform, there's a little Bill Smith put a little plaque for Bob Main, recognizing his work in the Deschutes Basin. So that's kind of neat. So in the Deschutes River, you see these two pictures here. When Bend was settled, the river was used in a way on the left. Today, folks moved to Bend and they use the river in the ways on the right. So things have changed on both on a smaller time scale and then from a longer time scale. But if you think back to the mindset, late 1800s, early 1900s, and people settling the West was very sparsely populated. And the federal government wanted people to come out and settle the West. So one of the things the federal government passed was called the Carey Act. And the Carey Act was passed in 1896. And it said that if a person will settle on a piece of property, put water to use on that property, they'll become owner of that property. And it was 40 acres, 80 acres, 160 acre chunks. So a pretty big piece of property was given to you if you were put water to use on that property. Most of the Deschutes Basin irrigation districts were developed that way through the Carey Act. It's kind of interesting through property records within the basin. There are parcels today that if you look on the county assessor, who owns the property, it says state of Oregon. And a lot of the ownership of those properties defaulted to the department because the landowner couldn't put water to use, it didn't work out, and the state took over possession of those pieces of property. There's also some of the irrigation districts own a lot of property around Central Oregon, and it's through the Carry Act and the default on the owner to try to develop that property where the district got it. So I don't know how many folks look at property ownership or who owns what, or on the public lands. I do a lot because I like to go hike and see where I can hike on public lands, but I'll come across state-owned land. So it's just kind of interesting. And that's the reason why that is because of the early development of water and water resources in the Deschutes Basin. In 1913, the speculation on water in Deschutes was so great that the state engineer, which is the former entity of the Water Resources Department, said, all right, enough's enough. We're going to stop any further speculation on the Deschutes River, and said no more. But they said, we're going to set aside a certain amount of water as like a reservation to build a project called the Deschutes Project. It kind of, I think about it, you know, back in 1913, there was so much speculation. I think the number is about 5 to 6 times the flow of the Deschutes River at Bend. People were saying, okay, I want to use water. Here's my plan. And it was exceeded the flow by 5 or 6 times. So that's when the state engineer said enough is enough, but set aside some water to build the Deschutes project, which became the North Unit Irrigation District that we see today. One of the things in that early development was that there was a big debate in Bend over where the Deschutes project was going to be built. Was it going to be built in the Madras area, or was it going to be built around Bend? Because at that time, Bend was the hub of development. The timber and water were the 2 big commodities that helped Bend become Bend. There was a little challenge from other areas where they wanted the water, they wanted the development. The railroad was making its way up to Central Oregon, and so there was a lot of posturing and a lot of debate over where development was going to occur. But it ended up being in Bend, and that is the reason why Bend is here. Also, the other thing I wanted to mention is that when people settled here, there were no grocery stores that you could go down and buy your food. If you wanted to live in Central Oregon, you had to grow your own food. So water was vitally important to produce food for both your animals and yourself. And so, you know, people ask, well, why did they allocate all the water out of the stream and didn't leave any in stream? Well, if you go back 125 years, to live, to survive, you needed the water, and they considered any water that made it past the diversion was wasted. And that was the mindset back then. Of course, we don't have that mindset today. Things are much, much different. The values of, you know, wildlife, river flows, recreation, all those sort of things, quite different today than they were back then. But you have to realize, though, that folks, to survive, they needed that water diverted out of the stream to grow food. So these irrigation districts, through the Carry Act development in the early 1900s, with the speculation with the existing rights and the Deschutes project looming, they realized, the engineers studying the hydrology of the system realized that, hey, there's not enough water in the river, the natural flow of the river, to survive or supply, excuse me, all the water that we need to divert. So in 1922, Crane Prairie existed, but it was a rock crib dam. Do people know where Crane Prairie is? Okay, it's up in the Cascades. The original dam, what they did was they cut down trees, they'd lay the trees down, and they put rocks in the trees. And then they put more logs and more rocks. And that's how they built the dam. Well, that didn't muster today's engineering standards. So the federal government decided we're going to build Wickiup Reservoir. First they did some testing at Benham Falls, which is a few miles south of here, near Sun River. And they started drilling test holes around the Benham Falls area. And that's where the original proposed reservoir was going to go. But when they drilled in there, with the drilling machine, the water would just seep down the holes. And they said, this is a terrible place for a dam. It's going to leak like crazy. And the state, if you guys know the story of the Tumalo Irrigation District, and the dam that's out. There's been a couple articles in the paper recently about Tumalo Dam. The state had experience on bad dams. We don't want to make that mistake again. So they found Wickiup Reservoir and started building Wickiup Reservoir in the late 1930s. But that water would be water needed for to meet that Deschutes project and make it viable. And so Crank Prairie Crescent Lake Dam was rehabbed. It also originally was a rock crib dam. And then the North Unit project. So late 1940s, the system was pretty much in place on the Deschutes and things were rolling along. So just business as usual, irrigation season, until about the 1990s. And then people started moving here for other reasons, not just to grow crops and have fields. They wanted recreation. One of the benefits of folks with that different mindset, different values is that the flow below Bend, which is the flow north past the diversion, used to be less than 30 cubic feet per second. And now it's roughly 130 cubic feet per second. And also some changes on the flows below Wickiup Reservoir, gone from 20 CFS to 100 CFS cubic feet per second. But there's different reasons for that. So not only building reservoirs, diverting water, which there's a fact, believe it or not, that 98% of the flow of the Deschutes River is diverted at Bend during the summertime. That's a pretty remarkable number. There's not much left for the stream going north towards Madras. Believe it or not, that 30 CFS that I was talking about below Bend was codified in an agreement. It was called the Gentleman's Agreement. So the irrigation districts got together. They sat down with the Watermaster at the time and said, and they were upset with the Watermaster because the flow would fluctuate tremendously. It would go from 0 to 100. And the district said, this is not acceptable. There was no water right below Bend. So there was no protection. So believe it or not, the irrigation districts have the right, or had the right, to dry the river up completely. So through the river house section where that hotel is, convention center, would have been dry. But they realized, well, from a PR standpoint, that wouldn't be so good. And so they said, okay, Watermaster, we don't want you to let more than 30 cubic feet per second below Bend. And that was set up in 1961. And so from 1961 to about 1990, that was kind of the rule, 30 cubic feet per second. Yes.
Is that measured above or below Tumalo?
Tumalo Creek mouth, above Tumalo. So there's a gauge. Shoot, can't think of the name of the hotel there. I want to say the Shiloh Inn, but that might not be right. What's the name of the hotel on the north, just on the north edge of Bend as you take that O.B. Riley Road exit? Anyway, Shiloh? Okay. Our gauge, that used to be, it's called Deschutes River below Bend, which meant that the gauge is below Bend, outside of Bend. The hotel is grown around the gauging station. So our gauge is there. It's just tucked in between the hotel buildings, but that's Deschutes River below Bend. And that's where we measure the 30 cubic feet per second and the restoration of flows. Believe it or not, there were some innovative and creative people in Central Oregon that recognized that, you know, how much water is diverted in Bend has a great detriment to the river and its aquatic resources. What can we do about that? And the genesis for the 1987 In-Stream Water Rights Act with some folks that were, I want to say Water Watch, but that might not be correct. Back in 1987, there was some in-stream interest developing at the time. And they said, you know what, the Deschutes Basin is a great example of where conservation and in-stream water rights would have a beneficial effect on stream. And so in 1987, Oregon legislature passed the In-Stream Water Rights Act. And the basis for it was really conceived out of the Deschutes Basin because of the amount of water that was diverted from the stream, its impacts to the stream, but then also how much water was lost in the diversion. So about 50% of the water diverted in the canals around Central Oregon is lost in transmission. And when I say lost, it's lost from the canal, but it's not lost to the system. That water goes down to the groundwater table, enters the water table, and then discharges above Lake Billy Chinook in those huge springs that are down there. And so it's lost to the canal, but it's not lost to the system. And the idea was, what can we do? We can do conservation projects, create saved water, put that water in stream to help the stream out. And so in 1987, that law was changed. And then the big thing was that up until then, in-stream water uses were not considered a beneficial use of water. And so it kind of changed the fundamental way we look at water in stream. In 1996, the Deschutes River Conservancy was formed. That was Senator Hatfield's idea. One of the things that's interesting is that the Deschutes River Conservancy was thinking about strategic goals, had some really high caliber folks on board that, were visionary, doing work in the basin. And then there was another group in Klamath Basin. It was called the Hatfield Group. They hadn't even decided on a name yet. And I participated in both groups early on in my career. And it was amazing how forward-looking and how productive the Deschutes River Conservancy was compared to the Klamath Basin. The Klamath Basin at the time, around 2001, had just suffered severe drought. And really the group was just getting to the point where people would actually talk to each other and not be mad at each other. Whereas here in the Deschutes, same group, but the missions were quite different. It was an incredible contrast and perspective for me. The legal flows, I talked about the gentleman's agreement. That's not legally protected water. So legal flows, something that has a water right associated to it, 0 in 1996, 150 at its peak in 2006. It's dropped off a little bit since then for various reasons, but still that 130 CFS from where we started out was 0. So like I mentioned, the Central Oregon's water resources and irrigated grounds developed within the irrigation districts. There's 8 of those, again, divert most of the water at Bend. A lot of other stream systems in Oregon, particularly on the east of the Cascades, irrigation districts don't play as a prominent role as it is here. A lot of places, and early settlement in Central Oregon was done by an individual who settled on a piece of property next to the stream, and they could dig their own ditch, bring water in from the stream to their own property. And that was the end of it. So it was a private system. They managed it. They took care of it. They were overseeing the work, whatever maintenance that was needed for their own benefit. Most streams in Oregon, east of the Cascades, are utilized that way, where there's individual ditches. There's some of those on the upper part of the Crooked River, the tributaries to Ocho Reservoir, where the water rights are owned by the individuals. In Central Oregon, you can see this map. That's the irrigated portion of the land that's managed by the irrigation district. So an irrigation district's a little different. The water right is held by the irrigation district. They maintain the ditches. They make sure the water's delivered. They do all the overseeing of the management of the water. And then there's patrons that pay the irrigation district for that service. And probably the number one, maybe the number one misconception from folks that have irrigation district water rights is that they are paying for the water that they're getting. And that's not true at all. They're not paying anything for the water. What they're paying for is the service of delivery. Does that make sense? Are anybody here irrigation district patron? Oh, wow. Who, Matt? What? Arnold. Nunzi? Tumalo? Tumalo? COI? COI, okay. Well, there's a disparity. Oh, you did? Okay, yeah. They've gone up just like everything else. So So there's a disparity in supply here in the room. The Central Oregon Irrigation District has a more senior water right priority date than the Arnold or the Tumalo. And so the COI has water longer in times of shortages. And would you concur, your COI folks? You got water all summer long. It's not the case for Arnold or Tumalo. They didn't get water all summer long. And that has to do with, oh, yes.
Kyle, there's a question that came through
Okay.
from the Zoom. Craig would like to know, would it be legal for the ODWD to charge for water? Right now, it is the only resource that the state doesn't charge for. Money could be used to fund the department. So it's also on the.
Okay.
Oh, you probably didn't hear that.
Oh, I see. So the department will not be in charge of making that decision. That would require the state legislature to pass a law that says, oh, now the state is going to charge folks for their water that they use. That's been debated, certainly has over the years, but that's not up to the department to decide. That's our state representatives and the governor to decide that question. But it's true that, yeah, water, people don't pay for a water right once they get it. Yes.
So if they're not paying for the water, why do I hear the story that if you don't use it, you lose it? So help me with that disconnect.
Okay. That's a good subject matter for discussion over beer. Use it or lose it. So there's a statute, it's ORS 54610, that says that if you don't use your water at least once beneficially every 5 years, that water right is subject to forfeiture. But then you have a big long list of things that are called rebuttable presumptions of forfeiture. And that's due to climate conditions. You didn't need the water. Your property was enrolled in a federal reserve program, drought, those sort of things. Those are things you can say that the water right is not forfeited. The use it or lose it is a fundamental principle, kind of like a pertinency, priority date, and the amount of water you're able to divert. Use it or lose it is one of those fundamental principles of water law. And the reason why it's there is that you don't want a water right that you hold and then not use it for however many years and then decide that, oh, I'm going to use it. And all the people that were using water that are maybe junior in priority date to you got used to and developed their property and invested in all their needs. And then if somebody comes along, 20 years later and says, okay, I've got this water right and I'm going to start using it now. Now those people that were enjoying the water before no longer have access to it. So that's one of the reasons. It's called a usufructuary right. That means you need to keep using it to maintain that water. The 1987 In-Stream Water Rights Act recognized that use it or lose it, and they created a avenue for folks to maintain their water right, but not having to use it on the land. You can temporarily lease it in stream, and that counts as 1 year of beneficial use. You're helping out the stream and you're maintaining your water right. So in 1987, that was recognized as something that, we need to tweak that a little bit. We need to do something with that law. And so it's, my perspective is probably because I'm in the middle of it. It makes sense for me because I can see the benefits of it, but from the outside, I can see that, why is this there? It doesn't make any sense. But hopefully some of my examples, illustrate the use it or lose it. Hopefully that answered your question a little. Oh, yes.
Okay, I'm gonna try to formulate this question.
Okay.
It's bugging me, but I don't feel like I know enough to even formulate the question. But I recently was at the Thornburg hearing before the county commissioners.
in which the issue is that by county code, cannot be, there's a no net loss to in the water, and that means in stream, I think the aquifer is all connected. And so I think the issue coming up, which I could not quite understand, is that Thornburg was claiming a water right that they were buying or getting, but it was also presented that that water right had not been used for like 20 years or something like that, so that it actually was not part. I think ODFW argued that it was not, I'm not sure if I'm getting my facts right, but that it's not part, because it's an old water right that's actually defunct. It doesn't, they took that water now, that it would be causing a degradation. It would be a net loss to the system. So that goes back to your point, is that the system is now operating, just barely hanging on by the skin of its teeth, as I can determine, because it's, you know, and I've listened to people from the Oregon Water Resources Department describing that our aquifer continues to go down, and that they say within 20 years, it's going to be a disaster, in short. And they're saying, dear public, tell us what we should do. Should we submit more well applications, right? And I'm listening to the guys from Oregon Water Resources talk about an agency that's 65 years, almost my lifetime. And they're talking about a water system that they've not lived up to their mission, which is to protect the water for future generations, for the ecosystem, and for economic health, right? And so I'm anyway, sorry, I'm getting a little bit.
Well, why don't we hold off? So I knew Thornburg was gonna come up. I don't want to talk about it right now, but at the end, I'll give you some perspective on it. How about that?
Okay.
Yeah. And my computer's locked up. I don't know what's wrong. Let me escape. Yes.
We're talking about in-stream flow rise so far. Does the state of Oregon have groundwater?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, one of the things interesting, I just did an interview with the Columbia Insight magazine. There was a reporter that's freelance that had some questions. She had heard that the irrigation district diversions had been declining over the past number of years. And to her, that sounded counterintuitive because all the things that are going on and growth and that sort of thing. And I said, yeah, it's actually true. The irrigation district's diversions overall on a growth sense have been declining. They peaked in the 1950s, and due to some drought conditions, conservation practices, and which are piping and lining, more measurement, switching from flood irrigation to sprinkler irrigation, has led to a decrease in diversions for the districts in Central Oregon, substantially. So in the 1950s, things peaked. We also, in the 1950s, was peak snowpack over the last 130 years in Central Oregon, at least. For Oregon, the snowpack in the 50s was huge. And the amount of water that was flowing through the system was incredible. And we haven't seen anything like that since such a long span of tremendous years. So the irrigation districts diverted nearly 1 million acre feet a year at Bend in the 50s. And so 1 acre foot is 43,560 cubic feet, or it's 326,000 gallons. So 1 acre foot is a lot of water. The districts diverted 1 million. And that just over the years from the 50s until about 1991 or 2, it kind of leveled off, but that decrease dropped down to about 700,000, 600 to 700,000 acre feet. So that was a pretty big difference. But that in the 90s, when I started with the department, we had 3 years of exceptional drought conditions. So 90, 91, and 92 were incredible drought, probably some of the worst drought conditions we'd seen since the early 1940s. One of the bellwethers was, can't remember if it was 1941 or 1942, the Arnold Irrigation District was shut off. And we had to shut the Arnold Irrigation District off my first year as Watermaster in 1992 because they ran out of water. So 1992 was the first time that Arnold Irrigation District ran out of water from the 1940s. And then the last 3 years, we've had incredible drought conditions where the Arnold's been short for, I think, 3 years now. Yeah, so the drought conditions we're seeing today are the worst I've seen in 30 years. And I go back and look at the records, and it's the worst in the last 100 years where our records started. So it has been bad these last few years. Make no bones about it. All right, so this is where my PhD guy comes in. He puts these things up here. So the point of this slide is to show, you see Oregon there with the arrow, low pressure systems coming out of the Gulf of Alaska and the jet stream heading from the east to the west, and some of the incredible power in the jet stream this past month. I watched this guy that has a YouTube channel, Pacific Northwest Weather. His name's Michael Snyder, and he does a weather forecast every day on YouTube. And he was showing some of the jet stream, and the power was the highest or most powerful on the planet. That Pacific jet stream across the ocean coming into California where all those storms were hitting. Another impact on our weather on the coast is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the El Nino, La Nina series. Those, believe it or not, at the equator, the systems are running from the east to the west, whereas the jet stream is running from the east to the west, and the southern oscillation is going from the west to the east. So they're backwards. It creates Coriolis effects on systems. It's kind of fascinating, the weather in the Pacific and its impact on Central Oregon. But that's where our weather comes from, Pacific Ocean conditions and that jet stream. So getting into a little bit of geology about Central Oregon and why we're here. We are blessed with the Cascade Mountains, not only from the standpoint of the view, but from our water supply. Storms come in off the ocean, they stack up against the Cascades and then drop that precipitation on the Cascade Mountains. Where there are places in the Cascades that receive between 100 and 150 inches of precip a year. What's great also about the Cascades is they're young, geologically speaking, hundreds of thousands, just a few million years old. So that material, the volcanic material up there, readily absorbs the precipitation and snowmelt, goes into the ground, makes its way under Bend, under Redmond, and then discharges in the Lake Chinook area. So that groundwater system we have here is tremendous. And thank goodness, a lot of people that move here talk about, well, we live in a desert. We're using all this water. Well, thank goodness our recharge doesn't occur solely how much precip we receive in Central Oregon and Bend and Redmond. If that were the case, we would not be here. There would not be enough water to sustain the folks that are here now. But we are blessed with that water supply coming from the Cascades, coming this direction. So we have these huge springs in this area, and they're some of the most renowned in the world as far as volume and consistency, and just a general overall massive groundwater system that we have here. Yes.
So even the water that falls on the west side of the Cascades is some of that runoff comes over here as well.
That's right.
Just depends upon where on the range and the altitude of it.
Yeah. So on topography, on basins, you look at the elevation and the surface runoff. So scientists or geographers can trace the boundary of a drainage basin and say any runoff that occurs in that basin makes its way down to your river system. Well, with groundwater doesn't care about the topographic divides. And believe it or not, you must have read the USGS report, because the Metolius Basin is an anomaly. It receives about 800 cubic feet per second from the Willamette Valley's drainage. So that wonderful Metolius River takes water, not takes, but gets water from the Willamette Basin. So we steal it and it runs into the Metolius River. So that's part of why the Metolius is such a robust, consistent river system. 800 cubic feet per second. Well, while we're talking about that, so in that area where Lost Lake is, where that sinkhole developed, scientists looked, well, where's the water going that's leaking in Lost Lake? Actually, it's the headwaters of the Mackenzie River is where it goes. So somewhere between Lost Lake and the divide, the water that falls in snow in that area north towards Mount Jefferson heads to the Metolius Basin. I just want to point out here the circle area is kind of the Klamath Basin drainage part of my region. It has similarities to the Deschutes Basin as far as the groundwater system. There's a really, really consistent stream. It's called Spring Creek. It's at Collier Memorial State Park. That flow of that river varies about 20 cubic feet per second over decades. So right now it's pretty low. It's running about 270 cubic feet per second. At the high, in the really wet times, it flows about 300. So it only varies 10% from highs to lows over decades. It's one of the most consistent spring systems that I know of. And then the other part of my area is Lake County. So the Lake County area, you can see, well, I'm not going to step over that. The Summer Lake area, Goose Lake, and then Warner Valley. Those are all closed basins. So the water that drains from those areas ends up in the basin, and then evaporation takes care of the water in those areas. Has anybody heard about Lake Abert recently? Yeah, so it's been dry for over the last 10 years. It's been dry 3 or 4 times, but has severe impact on the migration of the bird waterfowl, and there's effort afoot to do more monitoring there, put some effort into organizing a stakeholder group into coming up with solutions about what can be done for Lake Abert. So it's a casualty of this drought conditions that we've seen over the past couple of years in this area. This is a really detailed illustration of the drainage system for the Upper Deschutes River. We have, my mouse will work here. Okay, so here's Crane Prairie Reservoir, and each of these dots are gauging stations. So not only does the Watermaster regulate water use among water right holders, we also measure stream flow through gauging stations, and a lot of those are on telemetry. So any one of you, and so on weekends and at nights, I'll log on and see how streams are doing. Do that all the time. Any of you have access to those streams too. So if you're a fisherman, a rafter, whatever, you can look at telemetry gauging stations and see how the stream's doing. But anyway, these around Crane Prairie, and then we go through the Deschutes to Wickiup Reservoir. Here's Davis Lake. There's no natural outlet at Davis Lake. Oops. And Odell Lake right here, that's a glacially carved out lake, Crescent Lake. Here there's the Tumalo Irrigation District has water rights to Crescent Lake, and they built a dam on the outlet. So Crescent Lake, if you look at the contents, it says it's at 5% or 8% recently. That is the amount of water that's stored on top of the natural lake. The good thing about Crescent Lake is that there's a natural lake. There was a natural lake existed prior to the Tumalo Irrigation District building a dam on the outlet. The natural lake, believe it or not, is 500,000 acre feet in size. So it's a huge lake. So the storage that Tumalo takes is the top 20 some feet. Right now it's really low. But what I want to point out is that in normal and older stream systems, and you see a little bit of it here, this dendritic pattern of channels and drainage where the stream incises into make canyons and define river channels. A little bit like that in the Little Deschutes. But if you look over here, there's just flat areas and no stream system. The reason why I mentioned earlier is that that is all young volcanic material, and whatever falls as snow in these areas where we have, you know, the 100 inches of precip right up here. All that area in there along the Cascade soaks into the ground and then discharges as springs, like Fall River, Spring River. All the tributaries around Crane Prairie are spring fed at some degree, the Metolias. So very unusual geology up there, and this graphic will illustrate that. My computer's slowing down. So I had a graphic here that showed where that Snow Creek gauge is. There it is right there. That's Snow Creek. That's the highest gauge in the state right there. Here's the Three Sisters, Mount Bachelor, somewhere around here. But the consistency of that groundwater flow is illustrated in this graphic. So we have a gauge called the Deschutes River below Snow Creek. It's partially spring fed and then also somewhat of a component of surface water. So how many people have been to Lava Lake? All right, Little Lava Lake's right next to Lava Lake. So Little Lava Lake is the headwaters, the surface expression of the headwaters of the Deschutes River. So if you go to Little Lava Lake in wet times and there's a channel that runs from Little Lava Lake, that is actually the headwaters of the Deschutes River. So downstream of that, we have a gauging station, and you can see that it flows fairly consistent, but never goes much above 500 cubic feet per second. So it's a pretty big stream system. During flood, dry times, it's still pretty consistent. If we compare that to the Little Deschutes gauge at Lapine, I mentioned in the area that all the precipitation snowmelt enters the ground, discharges as springs, that suppresses those flashiness and is pretty consistent. However, the Little Deschutes is slightly different. It's still somewhat of a spring-fed system, but not anywhere to the degree that the main stem Deschutes is. So you can see the Little Deschutes flows, it hits zero at some times or really low, but then during the 1964 flood, which was a major flood in the Pacific Northwest, the flow exceeded 3,000 cubic feet per second. So that is a dynamic in the system that we kind of deal with from a water management standpoint. And it throws a little bit of a variability in the water resources and management in the basin. But just to illustrate that the Deschutes River has a great, large component of groundwater, spring fed, but also has a little degree, a variability in the Little Deschutes. There's no reservoirs on the main stem Little Deschutes. The Crescent Lake is the only reservoir on a tributary, which is Crescent Creek, to the Little Deschutes. This connection between surface water flow and groundwater in the USGS report from 1998 recognized that, wow, there's an amazing correlation between the flow of Fall River and a well that the state has been monitoring since the 1960s. And you can see that Fall River is a surface water, we have a gauge there, and the well is water level. And the correlation between water level and the flow of the river is remarkable. And so you can use stream flow. We have longer records of stream flow, and you can infer maybe what the groundwater table did back in time based on the flow of the river using that correlation. One of the things that I want to make a connection here and throw out a new concept, and we'll kind of digress from science to policy, is the mitigation program. And so in the mid 1990s, development was occurring. There was a lot of golf courses being proposed, and people were saying, well, they're going to start using a lot of groundwater. How good is our groundwater system? Should we take a look at it? So the state of Oregon and the USGS and the Warm Springs tribes and the cities got together and put together a funding package for the GS to study the groundwater in the basin. And from about 1993 to 1998, a lot of evaluation, monitoring, measurement. And in that era, it was the first kind of generation of groundwater flow models were being developed by the GS. And so the result of all that analysis and work was that indeed the groundwater in the upper Deschutes Basin is connected to the lower Deschutes River. And there are protections on state scenic waterways, which the lower Deschutes happens to have. And there was a court case in Portland, it's called the Dyack case, where city of Portland wanted to divert some water out of the Sandy River. I think it was the Sandy. And some folks said, well, we don't want you to do that because it's going to affect the Sandy River. And being it's a scenic waterway, it has protections. And that case was decided in favor of the person, Dyack, that was their last name, said that yes, the department cannot issue a new water right if it's going to affect a scenic waterway. And so in the Deschutes in 1998 realized, oh, if we issue, the department did, if we issue new groundwater rights in the upper basin, it's going to affect the scenic waterway on the lower Deschutes. And we can't do that. And in 1998, there was development and pressure. Well, what are we going to do? So the department initiated a working group to figure out and solve the problem. And that's the genesis of the Deschutes mitigation program. So in the Deschutes Basin, unlike any other basin in the state, we have a programmatic mitigation program that is the quantity, the parameters, how it's administered, all those sort of things are known. Some people don't like the mitigation program. They don't think it protects the scenic waterway enough. It's an additional expense when somebody needs a water right. It's hard to understand, but it actually works pretty well. From my perspective, from the department, we put something together that nobody else has. There was no book that you could refer to how we're going to do this. So anyway, in 2002, the rules for the mitigation program were adopted by the commission. And very shortly after that, the group called Water Watch sued the department and said those rules are not protective enough. And so from 2002 to 2005, the mitigation program was kind of in limbo. We weren't able to issue water rights or anything, but the legislature in 2005 said, we think the mitigation program rules are good. We're going to pass a law, and House Bill 3494 in 2005 was passed, signed by the governor, and the mitigation program got back into action. And so we've been operating since 2005 under this mitigation program. Oh, this graphic, I'll go a little bit more in detail of the mitigation program. I just wanted to illustrate another characteristic of the basin. This graphic shows where in the upper basin, we have stream reaches that are losing reaches and stream reaches that are gaining reaches. Most notably, the greatest loss in stream system is from Benham Falls area to Bend. We lose 50 to 80 cubic feet per second in the river channel. And then that also is a recharge component to the groundwater system. But then in the upper basin, the dark blue lines, and then in the lower part of the basin, it doesn't really show up here very well, but we have huge spring discharge. This is just another illustration of the connectedness between the surface water and groundwater in the Deschutes Basin. It's a tremendous interconnected system. And in one area, you do something, you're going to affect another area. So it's just one of the results of the groundwater study illustrated this. Yes.
So the water loss of just north of Bend, Benham to Bend, that's the percolation down into the system.
Yes.
Most of it to that.
Yep.
Goes right back into the groundwater.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So the streams lose water in areas and it gains water in area. And the gains are spring discharge to the system. So the point is that the Deschutes Basin as a whole is groundwater and surface water are intimately connected. You can't get away from it in this basin. So a little bit about the Deschutes mitigation program, and I'd throw out a question. Does anybody know what the name of that rapid is on the lower Deschutes River? Nope, that's called Buckskin Mary. It's just downstream of Dant. It's a little community that, there's a mine there, Pyrrolite? Can't remember the name of it. Anyway, there's a mine there and it's a little community, in the Deschutes Club reach of the river. So if anybody is fishermen, there's private residences along that area where there's a lock gate to get past it. But anyway, that's where that is. But I thought I'd throw that picture in there. If you don't want to listen to about the mitigation program, you can just admire the nice scene. So under the mitigation program, some components of it is that we set a limit on how many new water rights can be issued in the basin. So 200 cubic feet per second in total. So that's the limit. And we are at about 150 cubic feet per second has been issued so far. There's 30 cubic feet per second pending in applications. And so we have about 15 to 20 cubic feet per second under the cap at this point. So over, all coming up on 20 years that the program's been in place, we haven't reached the 200 CFS cap yet. There was a time though, I don't remember exactly what part of the decade it was, but there was a whole bunch of speculation. I think it was during that peak growth that Central Oregon experienced prior to the collapse, that everybody had a destination resort everywhere. And it was kind of a crazy time where people are just putting in applications for new water rights, and we exceeded the cap. However, when the economy declined, our department evaluated and went out to those applicants and said, really, are you really going to do this? And they said, no. So they withdrew their application. So we're back down to more realistic development. It was kind of like the same thing that happened in the early 1900s on the Deschutes in a way, but not to the degree there. The majority of, yes.
Can you give us an idea of how many cubic feet per second or whatever it is that a typical water right would entail?
Yes, so I talked in acre feet, which is a big number of water.
Okay.
Cubic feet per second is also a big number, really. It really is. 1 cubic foot per second is 449 gallons per minute. That is a lot of water. And the Deschutes River at Benham Falls in the summer flows 1,800 to 2,000 cubic feet per second. So that is a lot of water. The lower Deschutes flows 4,000 cubic feet per second. So we're talking a lot of water in the river system. Now, a water right on a farm, let's say we have 80 acres of irrigated ground. That 80 acres is allowed 1 cubic foot per second. The city of Bend, oh gosh, I don't know my mouth. So municipalities talking million gallons per day, and that doesn't translate that great to CFS. Million gallons per day is more than a CFS. But anyway, the city of Bend uses at its peak recently 27, 28 million gallons per day, which is somewhere around, let's say 30 plus cubic feet per second. So that's what the city of Bend uses overall. Yes.
So in terms of water rights, if someone has something like a farm, an acre farm, and then a developer comes in and wants to change it and build a lot of housing on it, it's still considered a beneficial use, I'm assuming. How does the water use connect between that a bunch of houses are going to use versus the farm use?
That's a good question. So we have to consider the source of the water right. So like we talked about, most of the irrigated ground here is from surface water through the irrigation districts. And this has happened at a huge level for the city of Redmond. The city of Redmond used to be pretty small, and right around the perimeter of the urban growth boundary was all irrigated ground through Central Oregon Irrigation District. And as the city grew, subdivisions were showing up where formerly irrigated ground. So the irrigation district couldn't or didn't want to, but couldn't leave the water right on that subdivision. So the irrigation district picked the water right up and for a time temporarily leased it in stream till either they decided to permanently put it in stream or sell it to another patron. And so you had an irrigation district water right on a piece of property. It was irrigated from Deschutes River water. That subdivision came in, the water right was picked up, moved, and the city of Redmond's footprint with their water right now takes the place. And so it's a city of Redmond water right that covers that subdivision. And the city administers the water and delivers it and has to comply with state law when it comes to what their water right says.
So do you know how much of in water rights, you said they're using 27 million gallons per day?
Peak, the most they used in a single day was somewhere around 26 to 27 million gallons.
My question is, in terms of the water right that they currently hold, how much more water do they have access to?
So I don't have the exact numbers. So the city of Bend, we'll just talk a little bit about City of Bend's water right. City of Bend has two sources of water. They have one water right from Bridge Creek, which is a tributary to Tumalo Creek, and their diversion is up near Tumalo Falls. And they recently put in a new pipeline that heads down the Skyliners Road. So their water right for Bridge Creek is to a maximum of 18 cubic feet per second. So that water right satisfied the city up until the mid 1960s. But as more population grew, the city of Bend said, hey, we don't have enough water in Tumalo Creek to meet our needs. We need to go to groundwater. So that's when the city of Bend started drilling wells around the area. They have lots of wells. It might be 15 to 20 wells for the city of Bend. And so as growth occurred, the city of Bend drilled more wells and acquired water rights from groundwater. So now they have water rights, and I don't know the number for the city of Bend. It's got to be in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 cubic feet per second in that neighborhood of water rights from groundwater. So they have 18 from Tumalo Creek and let's say 40 from groundwater cubic feet per second.
So how does that translate into how much they're doing?
The city uses, in the wintertime, this is another thing about municipalities. It's interesting. Municipalities' use in the wintertime is about 1/5 of what it is in the summer. And so the city of Bend can get by with about 5 million gallons a day in the winter. And then in the summer, as April comes and May, their use goes way up, and that's all due to outdoor irrigation. The municipalities have to deal with this situation, at least east of the Cascades, is that in their summer use, it's all outdoor watering where all the amplification of use occurs. So it probably on an average day, I would say that the city of Bend uses throughout the summer, if you average it, 15 to 20 million gallons a day in the summer. But like I said, that it's 5 million in the winter and then 20 some million in the summer. So it goes up a lot. And this is not just city of Bend, it's all municipalities that have outdoor watering. Yes.
So this might sound funny. I have to get my own head. So is that the cap or the 200 cubic feet per second? Is that an average over a year's time, or because you're saying in the winter it's so low, in the summer it's so high? Clearly you can't have.
So when the department issues a water right, we say your maximum rate that you can pump is, 1 CFS. And so the cap is based on the maximum.
So how does a company like Avion, that delivers domestic water, how does that tie into the city of Bend? Is that part of that, or is it?
No. So the Avion Water Company is one of the largest private water companies in the state. They serve within the city limits of Bend and outside the city limits of Bend and all over Central Oregon. They have different individual systems. Avion has their own water rights. So they don't have anything to do with the city of Bend's water rights. So the city of Bend has their own water rights. Avion has their own water rights.
Is it all groundwater?
Avion is all groundwater. Yep. So anyway, back to the mitigation program. We'll keep going. I didn't think I'd be able to talk this long, but I've still got a lot more time. One thing I noticed as you get older, I like to say this, old men like to tell stories, you know, so I'm getting to that age. So folks wonder who takes care of this mitigation program? I mean, who oversees it? So it's the department. Our department administers it. We issue the water rights. We track all use from the standpoint of the water rights that are required to mitigate. We monitor stream flow. A lot of people have a question, well, if you put something in stream, how do you know it's there? Well, we have the gauging stations and we monitor the flows, what should be there based on the water rights, what was put in stream, the quantities and the time and place. We monitor all of that for the mitigation program. We also, in Salem, there's folks that track the credits, where they go. There's actually oh gosh, I can't think of the name, what it's called, but they track the credits. When exchanges between, when it buys and sells, we track who owns them, where they're going and all that. So it's all tracked. And believe it or not, our department wasn't given any additional staff to implement this program. So it was tough at the beginning. Now we have lots more people, but at the beginning, you know, back in 2005, they just said, do it. And so we had to do it. So anyway, there's a lot of questions about how the mitigation program is overseen, and it's done by our department. Yes.
It sounds like we're approaching the 200 CFS ceiling.
Yes, we are.
And so as Ben, for example, grows into the more rural areas, and some of those are irrigated, like Arnold on the south end of town, what's going to happen? I mean, that water right has to go off of that land, but we hit that 200 CFS ceiling, somebody can't apply for a groundwater right to mitigate that water that can't, or got to move somewhere. I don't understand why the need for the ceiling, I guess, is the question.
That is a great question. Why the ceiling was put in place. I think, you know, I was part of the original working group, sat in on all the meetings, was part of the department's discussion on the policy development, how are we going to implement it? And I don't remember why 200 CFS was set. That I think my thinking about when we were developing it was we didn't want it unlimited, because the folks were saying, well, gosh, you know, will this work? We don't want just unlimited development in the basin. Let's set a reasonable cap. We had at the time a backlog of these applications were building up in the department because we weren't issuing water rights, and they were coming in the door and they were sitting there, and some of them were years old. We're waiting for a decision. We thought, well, we have about 200 CFS, we think, of future development over the foreseeable future. 200 CFS. So 200 CFS, does that make the folks, the environmental side, comfortable? Yeah, I think that's okay. And our department says, well, it gives us enough flexibility to issue water rights, get the program going, and see how it works. Spot time is basically what it is. The mitigation program actually has a sunset in its statutes in 2028. December 31st, 2028. And so the department's going to have to do something with it. The cap might be part of that discussion. Yes.
Well, I'll ask, well, I don't know, maybe it's a dumb question or not, but they kind of jog my memory. I don't know if it's mitigation is it, or if there's something that keeps Ben from just grabbing everything that could affect LaPine, Ben, other towns around, because it's growing more than maybe extremely or moderate or whatever. If there's some kind of cap on that says, okay, you're allowed to get this much, but we can't give you more because we don't want you to affect somebody downstream or upstream, or I don't know if that's a very distinct question.
Yeah,
there's limits on what they do.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So a municipality they've got to comply with the land use planning. And there's a lot of that land use planning that has a 20-year horizon. So the cities, all cities in Oregon, look out 20 years. How many people do we expect to have in our urban growth boundary? How much land are we going to need to expand to accommodate the growth that we expect? And part of that discussion is, well, how much water are we going to need? So the city of Bend has looked out 20 years and speculated on how much water they're gonna need. And then they look at their existing water rights and say, do we have enough water rights or not? And they say, ooh, our projected growth, we're not gonna have enough water. We need to apply for additional water rights. And so the city of Bend has done that. They have room to grow in their existing water rights, but there is really no mechanism other than reasonableness where the city of Bend could come in and say, we're gonna apply for the next 20 CFS and we're gonna bring that application, existing water rights up to that cap, and that's it until something changes. So there isn't anything in there that can prevent that, but typically, a city is governed by a lot of regulation where they're not gonna just wildly speculate on water.
Stadium system, it's not just the city of Bend, but provides water, obviously, for businesses or residents, I don't know, so that's another one of the
Yeah.
consumers, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. And I mentioned back when we had the boom economy and people were speculating, that's kind of what happened then. Our department reevaluated and said realistically, and we got those withdrawn. So, I mean, I guess the bottom line is there's no protection, but, people are not at this point acting irrationally. Yes.
So the woman who was sitting next to me mentioned that she had heard there was a 20-year amount of water available, and that after that, it was kind of desperate. We already have people's wells going dry, reservoirs going dry. So realistically, how much growth can this area take? I mean, what is that 20-year based on? Are we talking about, we've been growing so fast that I'm pretty alarmed.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem to ever come up in real conversation when they say, yeah, let's build some more.
Yeah.
How much water, and how are we gonna be able to survive after year swimming?
So planning horizons are 20 years, but water supply, I haven't talked about this, and my graph here won't help you alleviate your fears at all. But I have some facts I can share with you to maybe help you with that. One of the criticisms, or it's not a shortcoming, but it's just not part of the mitigation program, is prevention of this sort of thing. This is a state observation well that is west of Redmond, and we've been monitoring it since about 1970. And so you can see it was fairly stable, about 280 feet below land surface until about 1990. And then we started to see a decline, and it's declined 30 feet in 32 years. So that's about a foot a year. And that's the groundwater table west of Redmond. The groundwater study in 1998 came out with a model to predict how much water is being used, where is it being used, where's the water coming from, the recharge areas, all those sort of things. And then we could run scenarios with that model about future growth and development. And we predicted we've got a pretty stable system here. Well, fast forward to 2008, and we saw these declines in the basin, and people started asking, why is the groundwater table declining? And so the USGS ramped up their study, collected a bunch of new and updated information, new streamflow information, redid the model with a newer version, and looked at, okay, what is causing this decline? And their analysis said that about 70% of the decline in the basin that we're seeing is due to climate, a drying climate that we've seen over the last 25 years. So it has been drier than the previous 30 to 40 years in the basin compared. So 70% of that decline is due to Mother Nature. 20% of the decline is due to increased pumping. So all the municipalities, when I say municipality, I mean city, the developments, Eelcrest, other developments, and then all the homes that are being built and drilling wells. So that's 20%. And the last 10% is the canals, lining and piping. So the smallest portion, or the smallest attribution to the decline, is due to the canals, piping and lining. And so if anybody's participated in any kind of land use decision discussion about canal piping, people raise their hand and say, what about the wells? Well, yes, canal leakage is recharging the groundwater, and it has artificially raised the water table in the basin. And as canals are piped, that recharge is going to decrease. And naturally the groundwater table is going to drop. But the majority of the drop is due to climate and a drying climate that we've seen over the last 25 years. Yes.
You might have to take a little side trip to explain critical groundwater area, but given when your mitigation process was put in place and a sunset was built into it, and the fact that you are pretty close to the cap, what's the chance that this basin can avoid a critical groundwater designation?
If I could answer that question, I'd be doing something else. Not to be flippant, but
The audience, what that means?
Yeah.
That means there are no more water rights given out. That means we start shutting them off based on priority date.
yes.
By law, that's what it means.
So you obviously have studied this or know something about it.
I'm on the rack advising OWR.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So, okay. Yeah, okay.
CGAs.
All right. So, oh, you are, okay. All right.
Yeah, and we will be the next critical groundwater designation in the state.
Yeah.
And there hasn't been one for 31 years. Even though the law was passed allowing OWRD to establish a basis and then say we can't go below this. We haven't done this in Oregon for 31 years.
Yeah. So in Oregon, there's these areas in the state that are called critical groundwater areas. And so the reason why that is an area designated because of excessive declines in the groundwater table. I showed you a graph, 30 feet of decline in the Deschutes Basin in 30 years. There's places in north central Oregon there where the water tables drop 400 feet. And so it's like, whoa, something's wrong here. We got to stop. And the department says no more issuance of new water rights, and the existing water rights, we've got to curtail how much you're using. And so we set out a safe allocation each year. And so the groundwater hydrologists figure out, okay, we can issue, or we can allow 5,000 acre feet pumped out of the ground in this area. And that's it. And so some people have junior water rights from groundwater. They don't get to pump their well at all. And so there are areas around the state where critical groundwater areas have been designated. To your point though, Harney Basin is going through this analysis and rules development for a critical groundwater area. I will say though, that the Deschutes Basin is not the Harney Basin. The Harney Basin doesn't have the cascades and doesn't have the recharge that we do. So we're still lucky here. So I'm gonna throw some numbers out. The annual recharge to the Deschutes aquifer is about 3,500 cubic feet per second per year. So 3,500 cubic feet per second, or about 2.7 million acre feet a year is recharged to the Deschutes aquifer. 2.7 million acre feet. In the Harney Basin, the recharge is 200,000, 250,000. And we've issued water rights that exceed that amount. So in that case, we've got more water rights than what can be recharged in the Harney Basin. In the Deschutes Basin, the groundwater pumping overall for all the cities, all the wells, all the irrigated ground is about 80,000 acre feet, maybe 100,000. So we have 100,000 acre feet of use versus 2.7 million acre feet of recharge. And so the cities like to say they're only 2% of the water use in the basin. Remember I mentioned that the districts divert 700,000 acre feet. So we're talking orders of magnitude difference. So even though our aquifer levels are declining, there is enough groundwater in the basin to sustain human use. And so if you think about a domestic well, if the person doesn't do any outdoor watering, their consumptive use is virtually zero. So outdoor watering, even on a domestic well, is where the big water use occurs. I live in the city of Redmond, and they have meters that report hourly data. So I can see when people take long showers and do a bunch of laundry in my house. But on a day that we don't outdoor water, we use about 120 gallons a day for 4 people in our home. When we are outdoor watering, we live on a, I'm gonna say 6,000 square foot lot. We probably have 2,200 square feet of lawn. We use about 1,400 gallons when we water the lawn. And so our use goes up by 10 when we water outside. Same thing's gonna occur on any rural home that if they have xeriscaping and no lawn, their water use is virtually minimal. But if they outdoor their allowed half acre, they're probably using thousands of gallons per day. So it's a big difference between home use, what a human needs versus outdoor watering. Outdoor watering is the biggest water use for a municipality or for a homeowner. So if you want to make a difference, is stop irrigating lawn. That will make a big difference in our water use. But I'm going to try to allay your fears is that the amount of water that's used for humans from groundwater is very small compared to the supply we have here. The reason why the mitigation program was developed was not because we're running out of water. It was developed because of the impacts to a scenic waterway on the lower Deschutes River. And that's why.
Well, yeah, I mean, all the rights, all the needs need to be taken care of.
Yeah.
So when that 20-year remaining water, what is that based on? Is that just the planning or is that something?
The 20-year from a city's perspective?
No, the 20-year, apparently 20 years of water remaining. And that lady that was saying.
Well, I don't know where it's unfortunate she left, but she said some things that I don't know where she got that information. She was talking about the department said it's a disaster. Our department's never said that. So some of the things she said were not actually something that our department would say.
I just wondered, because I'd heard that 20 years of water remaining before from someone else. So I was just wondering where that came from.
Yeah, I don't know. All I know is that planning horizons for cities are on a 20-year projection. But from a water supply standpoint, no, there's no 20-year. We're not going to run out of water in 20 years. There's nothing like that.
Have you forecasted when you're gonna hit that 200 CFS cap?
No.
Even with the drought, I mean, even considering the drought that we're in.
Yes, even considering the drought we're in. What's wrong?
Nothing.
Oh.
You just have a question.
Oh, okay.
Make sure I acknowledge that.
All right.
Oh, and you can.
Okay, how is the definition of beneficial use applied to new and existing water rights? Is any use considered beneficial? No. So one of the fundamental principles of a water right, like I mentioned, is the place of use, the rate, the priority date, the use it or lose it. The other thing is, what is the use? So when the department issues a water right, it's for a particular use. Traditionally irrigation, a city is municipal, any of the resorts are quasi-municipal water rights. And that use has to remain for that purpose. It can't just be used for irrigation one year and then the next year they want to put an industrial site in the area and use water for that. No, they have to continue to use the water for that beneficial use. Now, back in the day when water rights were first being utilized and the state looked at it, there was irrigation, stock water, and power and municipal. Maybe 4 or 5 uses. Now there's probably more than a dozen. Cranberry bogs, heat exchange, hydroelectric, just a variety. But our department looks at the beneficial use associated with the use. If a person, and then beneficial use is slightly subjective because I've heard conversations where if a person is applying water to a field and any water makes its way below the root zone, that's wasting water. So that's one perspective. Another is that flood irrigation is a waste of water because it's not the most efficient, best technology today. So as long as somebody's using water and is not wasting water, that's considered a beneficial use, as long as it complies with what the water right says the use is. And that's the best I can do as far as the definition of beneficial use. So beneficial use is the measure and extent of any water right in the state. It varies about, you know, what's considered beneficial use or not, and people have varying perspectives on beneficial use. So where we are, I'm going to transition into water supply and where we are now. So I have a bunch of graphics looking at our this year's our snowpack water precipitation and some other things. Then I want to get through these. So this is a map of the precipitation for the water year, and I have been very disappointed in this year's weather. After the drought years that we've been through and what we're getting so far, I am so disappointed. So for the precipitation for the start of the water year, which begins October 1st, the basin is at 80% of average, which is terrible. I was hoping we'd be at 150% by this time. So we're not. So it has been dry. It has been drier than average so far this winter. Another winter with drier than average conditions. So that's precipitation. And my computer locked up again. I don't know why it does that. What do we do? What? Oh, shoot. Boy, I did it then. I went ahead about 6 slides.
How'd you do that?
I was hitting escape. Sorry about that. My next graphics I'm going to show. So there, that one.
Okay.
Yeah, snowpack. So Mount Bachelor keeps their readings for snow as how deep the snow is, 70 inches or 69, I think, yesterday, today. Water resource managers don't care about how deep the snow is. What we care about is how much water is in the snowpack, and we call it snow water equivalent. And so these readings here, snowpack as of January 30th. So this is for the Upper Deschutes Basin, we're at 92% of average for our snow water equivalent, the more important measure of our snowpack. Now, this is a broader look, and you can see where all that water ended up in California, unfortunately. And it's almost like the state line is the line between the haves and the have-nots this year. You can see the Klamath Basin, 128% of average, but then in California and Nevada, where some places are over 200% of average. So that series of storms tracked just south of us. And although, you know, the Cascades aren't as good as the Sierras for capturing moisture, we still would have gotten more moisture. And boy, we sure could have used some of those storms hitting in Oregon. So California's been blessed this winter so far, still somewhat early. It's only February 3rd. We still have 2 months of our snowpack building season, but hopefully we can recover and get back above 100%. This time last year, we were at 100%. So we're actually a little better at this time last year, but there was a very peculiar weather phenomenon. So a high pressure system about the mid-January set up off the Pacific Northwest and sat there for 3 months and did not allow any moisture to come in. And that was unfortunate. So that high pressure system sits off of the coast. That's bad news for us for our weather. The jet stream either goes in a loop above us into British Columbia or goes down into California and we get left out. So high pressure is bad for the winter. Variability though, this graphic is, I just am amazed at this. So in 2021, it was a dry year, and the April-May snowfall at Crater Lake, which we have a 100-year record of, was tied with the lowest ever in 100 years in 2021. The following spring, 2022, so last year, we were going into the winter and the snow was starting to melt. And we were going, oh no, this is going to be worse than 2021. And we had a tremendous April and May of last year. And Crater Lake experienced the third highest snowfall in 100 years during April and May, from one year to the next. So really interesting. So California, huge drought. Reservoirs were low. We had 3 weeks of storms. Now all that changed in 3 weeks. So it can happen. I still got my fingers crossed. This is a graphic of the snow water content for the upper Deschutes Basin, which includes the Cascades and the Ochoas. And the black line is this year. The green line is average. And then the red line is last year. So late December and the first part of January for last year, we were just going like crazy. And then that high pressure developed off the coast. And we received no precipitation for 3 months. And then the snow started melting. And then I was going, oh no, this is horrible. But we did get a little rebound with that April, May snow, which left us actually with the snowpack above average for the remaining portion of the season till June. That really saved our bacon last year. It made a huge difference. The Crooked River, especially, we were looking at running out of water in mid-August. It actually got them another month's of supply of water for the Elko irrigation district. But this year, we've been running right along the average curve, and now we've dropped below average. So we definitely need some more precipitation. So that's how we're doing so far this year, about a little bit below average. And then Crook County, poor Crook County, has remained in exceptional drought for several years now. The designation for drought status is a portion of where you can see Oregon's got all the designations going from no drought, from abnormally dry to exceptional drought. The worst category in Crook County still remains in the west, the exceptional drought. And then you can see a little bit broader extreme drought. And the Deschutes County has a variation between severe, moderate to severe. So we're still in somewhat of drought conditions for Central Oregon, unfortunately. And this is how we were. So it was worse a year ago. You can see a big portion of Central Oregon, and unfortunately a big portion of the region that I manage was in that exceptional drought last year. So we have recovered. So here's today and here's last year. This is an interesting graphic. It is a little probably too busy for you, but I have stated that we've been in a really dry condition. This graphic illustrates that with data. So this is the monthly precipitation at Wikiup Reservoir. So the bars are the monthly precipitation, and I compared monthly precipitation from 2000 to present compared to average. So the difference between what would we expect for average and what did we get, and then you add each month. And if it's below average, the line starts declining. If it's above average, the line goes up. So you can see that big month we had, the line jumped up, but over a 22-year period, we see a deficit of 70 inches of precip at Wikiup Reservoir. And so the trend is really what you look at in this graphic, is that the trend over the last 22 years has been below average, cumulatively to the tune of 70 inches. So I don't think anybody questions whether we've been in a dry time and we are in drought. This is an illustration of how to quantify the extreme conditions that we're in Central Oregon. Now, if you go, north central Oregon, northeast Oregon, and the high part, they're actually not even in drought. So it's a very localized drought that we're seeing in this area. And I don't know what we did to make Mother Nature mad, but hopefully it'll turn around. Yes, you had a question.
Is there a concept of an accumulated debt for the droughts? Or do you reset every year and just use the average? And then the other question is, when was the average taken? Does the average continue to go down and the moving average is lower? So you have to plan for that lower average, or is this,
So drought isn't reset. It's the folks that monitor that. It's a moving average, so to speak. So you just, as you get into wetter periods, you start getting out. So it's a look back. I don't know what length of time to look back is, but they take into account reservoir, stream flow, soil moisture, precipitation, a whole bunch of parameters. Then look at that and say, okay, how bad are the conditions? And so it's a moving average is what it is.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the second part of your question was,
It was more like, are planning decisions based on the real average or based on?
when's the average? So typically for weather phenomena, you look at 30-year periods for your average. So you're comparing a 30-year period. So just recently, the average moved up a decade. So we're from 1990 to 2020 is our comparable. So that's our average. And just a few years ago, it was from 1980 to 2010. And so that was actually a wetter period, 1980 to 2010, than the period from 1990 to 2020. And our new snowpack readings are based on that recent 30-year period. And so the average actually went down a little bit. So if we were to say our average is below average now, if we were to look at our previous 30-year period, we'd be really below average. So it's actually, it's also a moving target as time goes on. This is a seasonal outlook for precipitation for the period February, March, and April. The northeast part of Oregon, unfortunately not central Oregon, is looked at above average. We're in the equal chances, so whatever average precip we get for that period is what they're predicting. I would not put too much money on how this turns out. It's just a kind of a seasonal outlook long term. And then temperature will remain below average, and the southern part of the US will be above average. This is another graphic, soil moisture through satellite telemetry and sensors. It indicates, so for today, you can see that red is dry. And then last year at this time, we were a little better off, the soil moisture was, than it is today. We'll go into detail. This is a teacup diagram for the Upper Deschutes Basin for 2022, the start of the irrigation season. So Wickiup Reservoir, 109,000 acre feet, 55% full when we started irrigation season last year. Prineville Reservoir, 27% on April 1st. That's the lowest Prineville Reservoir ever started an irrigation season since it was built. And it was built in 1961. And so we started out last irrigation season with low, really low to record low water levels. We ended up making it through that April and May storms really helped us out. And this is where we are today, or January 30th. You can see that Wickiup's made it back up to essentially where we started last year. And Prineville Reservoir is still setting record lows for this time of year right now. It is only 12% full. Kind of going through these kind of fast. Here's a graphic, another one of those that shows where Wickiup is compared to average, the red line. The blue line is today, and then the green line is last year. So at least we're better than last year at Wickiup. And then Prineville Reservoir, like I mentioned, setting record lows right now. And then Haystack Reservoir, it's a re-regulating reservoir. If anybody's been there, recreated or fished on Haystack Reservoir, it's internal to the North Unit irrigation system. So it's fed by a canal. It's not fed by a stream. Just so happens this year, the outlet gates on the dam failed, and the district and the Bureau of Reclamation had to repair it. So they drained Haystack, and it's the first time Haystack's been drained. And they worked on the gates, got them fixed. So they're now going to store water in Haystack. So it'll be back in operation this year. And then Crescent Lake, way below average, and it's very similar to last year. So far this winter, we haven't really seen much gains. Conditions are fairly similar to what they were last year, and the precip, like I said, 80% of average so far. So Central Oregon has just not broken out of the drought yet. Yes.
You were hoping for 150%.
I was hoping.
Is that because of El Nino? You were hoping for it, or does El Nino not typically give this part of the country a lot of extra moisture?
So El Nino plays a role in our weather, definitely. La Nina or El Nino. Typically El Ninos And it isn't 100% correlation. It's a loose correlation. I actually have a graphic. So it's a good lead in. El Niños typically provide water for California, drier for Oregon. La Niñas are supposed to provide water for us in Washington and not California, but you know, it's not a perfect correlation. So what about Oregon's future? Where are we going to go? What are we going to do about the future? One thing that the global climate models show is that they're expecting an increase, a slight increase in precipitation for, well, the globe, but also for the Pacific Northwest. These graphics show that they're forecasting. The graphic A is a look at a forecast for just precipitation only. The one on the right, B, is pressure. I don't exactly know what it's a atmospheric pressure and they look at increase in precipitation. And then that third graphic is the difference between the two. So the point of this graphic is to show that the models show that we should be getting more precipitation in the future. So you look back the last 20 years, what's been going on? Is it weather related? Is it La Nina? Is it the climate change? What can we expect in the future? You know, it's the future is predicted based on the models that we have. And you know, you look out 30, 40 years in the future, you know, how good is that model? What are we going to see? What is the department doing about climate change and how are we going to adapt to it? The one thing that I've been here in the basin for a long time is that the variability between a dry year and wet year far exceeds the predicted amount of effects from climate change. The biggest effect from increased temperature is evaporation. So these big water bodies like Lake Avert, Summer Lake, Upper Klamath Lake, they're going to experience more evaporation. And we see, you know, a trend that's pretty, you know, you can hang your hat on the fact that if it's warmer, there's more evaporation. So that's going to come into play as far as water supply. Will that be offset with increased precipitation as they predict? You don't know. So I don't want to pretend that I can predict, and I'm not a climate modeler at all. All I know is what I hear and see and read and people tell me. But I just want to share that, you know, this conversation of climate change always comes up and people want to know, what are we going to do about it? Well, the variability that we've seen in the past, we've gotten through it. We do go through wet and dry cycles. I've seen them. It just happens these last 20 years, we've been in a drier than average for a length of time. But how will that turn around?
And
Yes.
this is Pacific. This is the whole Pacific region, not just our area.
Well, this is looking at the index, so La Nina versus El Nino. So La Nina is the negative, La Nina is negative, El Nino is positive. What this shows is the variability over the years from 1930 with the PDO. And you can see where we're at right now. That is an indicator of snowpack for us. And so we've got a little bit of correlation here. It is way negative, and we really haven't seen our great snowpacks. So once it'll come back up, are we going to see snowpack, abundant snowpack again? So that's some of the things that the scientists are looking at. And it's a factor. It's not perfect correlation, but it's certainly something that the scientists have analyzed over time to see, well, where are we at? Is there an indicator? Is there a predictor about what we can expect? Yes.
What do we know about the impact of the fire damage, the extensive fire damage in California, Washington, Oregon, and the capacity of the ground? What's happening when fire? What do we know about?
Yeah. So when a fire comes through, a total stand destruction where there's no vegetation left, trees tend to intercept snow and they pile on the branches. That intercepts some of the precip making it to the ground. When the trees are gone, there's no vegetation. The snow makes it to the ground, but then the weather can sublimate that snow through wind, evaporation. So it goes from a solid phase to gas. Some of it seeps in. So initially, when you have a reduction in vegetation, that component of evapotranspiration is gone. So we get a little more recharge kind of overall, but as vegetation grows back, then it goes back to the way it was. But that only occurs for the first few years, but it's totally dependent on the geology, the soil type, the density, all those sort of things. So you can't really say one thing. But it does, a fire does have a tremendous effect on the hydrology of a drainage. And in areas like Crook County, if we were to have a huge fire in the Ochoco's, we would see massive increased runoff. So really debris filled, heavily sediment laden runoff in the Crooked River. So flashier than it already is.
So it would still end up in the rivers and the
Yeah.
groundwater.
Yeah, just timing is gonna change, yeah. Whereas the Cascades, it still soaks in the ground. So we're benefiting from that geology again.
Oh,
Yes.
interesting. Okay.
So on those models that you showed, where the Pacific Northwest is getting well precipitation, how finely tuned are those models? I mean, is it the entire Pacific Northwest, or is it mostly on the west side of the Cascade? Is there a way to know that?
Well, I think the picture that I showed the 3 Pacific Northwest states. So what I understand climate models is you have to grid the globe. So you put it in a certain grid, 1,000 miles squares or 5,000 miles squares. And then what they do is if they want to focus in on a certain area, they'll downscale those grid sizes to 100 square miles, 100 miles on each side, and then look at, then apply the parameters within that area. So what I showed you is basically a picture of the entire Pacific Northwest. It's not going to say Western Oregon versus Eastern Oregon.
Right, and how long have we been doing that kind of modeling? Do we have enough data to get a plus and minus?
Oh, I think 30,
100% of the plus and minus?
probably 30 years. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and
What kind of-
I'm not an expert at it. I couldn't tell you how, did anybody look back and say, oh, it predicted, like weather forecasters? They're right about, you can say they forecasted sunshine, and then you look back a day, were they right or not? With climate models, I don't know if
they are.
how accurate they are. Yes.
Actually, there was a report about 4 or 5 years ago on doing that comparison. And the climate models in their rough time started in the late 70s, early 80s.
Oh,
And
so long time.
The error bars were substantial, but basically they are doing very well.
Yeah.
And the new models are much better. And so the models are probably pretty reliable.
Yeah.
Oh. I just wanted to be like a little, maybe 2-minute warning, maybe a lot
Okay.
of time, 1 or 2 more questions. I want to respect everybody's time, especially with parking.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about the pine. Last 2 years, five wells have gone dry and 20 have been affected. And I was wondering, is that a concern for all of the building going on down there?
Yes, so in the Deschutes Basin, I didn't really touch on this, but over the past 3 years, we've seen an uptick in dry well complaints. However, you have to take it into context of wells that have been drilled over a span of 50 years. And so all wells are not constructed the same. There was a very common practice in the 80s when people would drill wells and their understanding of the water table in the basin was it was stable. It didn't move. So they drilled the well, they hit the water table and they went 20 feet and stopped, because who would want to pay a whole bunch of extra money to keep drilling down when we know the water table's stable and doesn't change? And so a lot of the dry well complaints are due to wells that have not much ability to absorb water level changes. So there's that. Some wells you drill and you turn the pump on and the water table in the well draws down 20 feet because this, what's called the specific yield of a well, is not very good. And so because of that drawdown, the pump will suck air. So they need to go down a little deeper just to make the well continue, even though when they turn the pump off, the water table comes back up and they still have 20 to 25 feet in the well. A well does not last forever. A typical lifespan of a well is 30 years. And so after 30 years, all the pore spaces in the well bore fill up with precipitate and its efficiency decreases. So a driller needs to come in and clean the bore out to make the well more efficient again. So that's another thing. So you have to take it in context. Also, we had 100 dry well complaints over the past year. There's over 20,000 wells in Central Oregon. So we have 100 out of 20,000. So take that into context. You know, yes, when it's your well, that the world comes to an end because you don't have water when it's your well. And when I was a kid, our well went dry. We didn't have water for a week. And so that was a big impact. When your well is dry, it's a shock. So I'm not discounting the effect it has on individuals, but I'm saying, yes, wells go dry. They've been going dry since they drilled wells. Just so happens we're in a dry spell. We have seen a decline in the water table, and there's been more than usual. But since I've been working for the department, every year we've had dry well complaints. It happens all the time.
You have a slide for the monitoring well that you said was near Redmond.
Yes.
DESC 3903.
Okay.
And that's an industrial well drilled for the Bureau of Reclamation. It was drilled in 1968. With what you've just said about the issues of the lifespan of wells or wells clogging, how do you use that as a relevant gauge to describing, or as the basis for describing the declines, compared to, for instance, a well that OWRD drilled that's, I don't have a DESC number, but it's between Bend and Redmond, that has seen a precipitous decline. I think it's in the 61,000 number, DESC number. It was a well that you had reported to the county in April of 2021 when you did a presentation to the Board of Planning Commissioners.
Yeah.
That had dropped 3.47 feet in 19 months. And subsequent to that time, that well has dropped, I think, another 3.56 feet in 17 months. So my question is, why are we showing old wells as example wells if there are newer wells that wouldn't necessarily be clogged with this congestion that you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, so good question. So when I was talking about a well's lifespan, 30 years, some wells will last 100 years, some won't. It depends on the geology. I was just throwing a round number. An impact is how mineralized the water is that's going to the well. That has a role, and then how much you pump it. The more you pump it, the more that mineralization can occur. If a well is used very rarely, it's not going to develop that mineralization. So it'll still function as a well, and it could last, it could last forever. So there's that aspect. The reason why I showed one chart is I already ran over my time. There's all kinds of data out there I could have presented. I didn't want to focus on just groundwater levels, or anybody can access the groundwater data that we have.
Well, I'm
And so
to know what data, water resources of its own creation, not relying on necessarily other people's older wells or other people's reporting of well use. What data the state has, and also how it relates to the Sisters Fault Zone and the geology that's distinguishing where a lot of the wells are drying are north of the Sisters Fault Zone. And anybody here who doesn't know about the Sisters Fault Zone, my geology isn't great, but draw a line through Bend and head up to the east side of Sisters. And the wells that are going dry are those on the north side of that diagonal line.
So the department has records of all the well logs that have been submitted. So that's one data point. And then we have numerous observation wells. Some of them are used, some of them are unused, and we measure those quarterly. So we have a robust data set for all the groundwater in the state. That's one thing. The one thing I didn't show is that any well that's along the Cascade shows no decline at all. It varies only with climate changes. So as it's drier periods, it goes down, wetter periods, it goes up. So all parts of the basin are not the same. The west side near the Cascades, there's no trend at all. Believe it or not. Redmond east towards Powell Butte, yeah, there's a decline. So, and it varies. There's the city of Bend has a well that's at the Pine Nursery. It hit the 50-foot decline since we started measuring. There's other places near the lower bridge where the decline is 3 feet. So it isn't the same everywhere, so it varies quite a bit. And that has to do with the geology and the hydrology in the area. So one size doesn't fit all.
Thank you, Kyle. For being sick, you did a hell of a job.
Yeah.